I called the FBI, right as my sister was about to say her wedding vows. No one in that castle knew beneath the glittering ballroom was a secret vault packed with laundered money files, drug trade clips, and a marriage paid for with silence. My sister was the bride, my mother the mastermind, and me, the forgotten sister, was the one who tore it all apart. If you think this is just another family drama, then you're wrong. Hit subscribe now so you won't miss the next chilling chapters, because this story is just getting started. My name is Isabelle Carter, and I have been invisible for as long as I can remember. In the Carter household, visibility was currency, and I was bankrupt. From the outside, we looked like the perfect New England family, pristine smiles, manicured lawns, and a last name that opened doors in Boston's oldest circles. But behind the carefully curated photos and ivory-colored dinnerware was a truth much colder, quieter. I was always the second daughter, the afterthought, the background character in a story I was never meant to lead. My sister Victoria was the kind of beautiful that bent rooms around her presence. Blonde hair that seemed to glow in candlelight, cheekbones sharp enough to cut, and a laugh engineered in some divine lab to be both alluring and unforgettable. By the time she turned 16, she was already gracing magazine covers and hosting interviews about the pressures of young stardom. Meanwhile, I was in the back corner of our high school's forensics lab, trying to convince the department head to approve my independent study on blood spatter patterns. "Can't you just join yearbook?" my mother had asked, sipping her grapefruit spritzer, not even looking up from the wedding portfolio she was curating for Victoria. Yes, wedding at 17. You spend so much time with the dead things. It's depressing, darling. Dead things. That's what she called my passion for forensic science. The irony wasn't lost on me how my family feared death more than they feared their own reflection. Truth be told, the dead never made me feel invisible. They didn't compare me. They didn't say my hair was too dark or that I slouched too much. They didn't remind me in the hushed tones of family brunches that I should really consider whitening my teeth or doing something about those brows. Victoria, of course, loved me in that hollow, performative way siblings sometimes do when they know they're the favorite. "You're so smart, Izzy," she'd coo at Christmas gift wrapping a sweater that was 2 sizes too small. God, if I had your brain, I'd be unstoppable. As if intelligence was a consolation prize. As if her beauty and acclaim weren't enough, she needed to own my strengths too. Wrap them around herself like a borrowed scarf and wear them without warmth. I didn't hate her. Not then. I just knew my place. At family dinners, my parents would rotate topics like a well-rehearsed panel. Father, the clinical surgeon with a god complex, would regale us with hospital horror stories, always ending with how Victoria's UNICEF ambassador role was such a better use of influence. My mother would correct his wine pairing mid-sentence and redirect the conversation to Victoria's latest Vogue interview or her upcoming photo shoot in the Maldives. If I tried to mention the cold case analysis project I'd been assigned at Quantico, or the fact that I'd been offered a guest lecturer spot in New York, there would be a polite nod. A distracted, "That's lovely, sweetheart." Then a quick pivot. Back to the golden child. I got used to nodding along with my own erasure, so when the wedding invitation arrived, I shouldn't have been surprised. But I was. Not because Victoria was getting married. She'd always drawn suitors like flies to champagne, but because of the way the envelope was addressed. To Miss Isabelle Carter and guest, back entrance instructions enclosed. The font was delicate, all loops and lace. The kind of stationery that smelled of pressed orchids and entitlement. But the message underneath brutal. No monogram, no affectionate nickname, no phone call or personal note. Just a formal RSVP and instructions like I was part of the catering team. There was no, "We'd love to have you know." It would mean the world. Just logistics. I held the envelope in my hand for a long time, sitting on the edge of my kitchen island, staring at the edge of the script as if it might rearrange itself, as if maybe I'd missed something. But no, this wasn't an oversight. This was a choice. I didn't cry. That's not how I'm wired. But I felt something shift like a thread inside me pulled taut for years had just snapped. I could still hear my mother's voice from 3 nights earlier on speakerphone. Just remember, darling, it's Victoria's Day. Don't wear anything that might distract from her gown. Maybe something navy, not black, not crimson, certainly not white. Navy, the color of submission. And now this envelope with its clinical detachment and glassy courtesy sealed the deal. I wasn't just uninvited from the spotlight. I was being escorted to the shadows and asked to be grateful for the seat. Victoria was marrying someone named Connor Hale. I'd never met him, never spoken to him, never even heard his name until the family group text exploded with save-the-date messages and photo dumps of their weekend trip to the Amalfi Coast, where he'd proposed with a diamond so large it could have doubled as a murder weapon. There had been no formal introduction, no dinner. Just a single text from Victoria 2 months prior. Guess who's off the market? V plus C. I was tempted to reply. Guess who never cared? But I didn't. I did what I always did. I swallowed it whole. My work as a forensic crime analyst had taught me many things: how to read blood splatter, how to reconstruct timelines, how to keep emotion out of evidence. But it had also taught me how to track patterns. And the Carter family. We were textbook. Narcissistic parental favoritism. Classic scapegoat/golden child dynamic. One sibling built for adoration, the other engineered to endure. The real question was, how long can someone endure invisibility before they become something else entirely? When I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror that night, the reflection felt unfamiliar. Older. Harder. My eyes, green and steady, didn't blink. My jaw clenched just a second too long. I wasn't angry, not exactly, but I was alert. Something inside me was paying attention now. Quietly. Sharply. I picked up the RSVP card, ran my finger over the gold trim and smirked. Then I ticked the box, will attend. I figured if I was going to be part of the background, I might as well observe everything. After all, you learn the most when no one thinks you're watching. The Hale estate rose from the Vermont treetops like something conjured out of Gothic literature. Tall spires, cascading ivy-stone gargoyles frozen mid-snarl. If not for the white-gloved valet waiting at the iron gate and the towering ice sculpture being wheeled toward the garden, you might have thought the place was abandoned. It was the kind of venue that whispered exclusivity and screamed wealth. A 200-year-old castle refurbished with just enough modern luxury to still feel haunted, just like my family. As my rental car crunched over the gravel driveway, I caught glimpses of guests in satin and silk descending from town cars. The kind of people who wore designer sunglasses at dusk and sipped champagne like it was tap water. I parked far from the main entrance near the staff lot. It felt fitting. Inside the lobby was breathtaking. Vaulted ceilings with gold filigree chandeliers that could have been lifted straight from Versailles, and a sweeping staircase that split into 2 arms like an embrace no one ever intended for me. Name, the woman at the check-in desk asked. Not unkindly. She didn't look up from her clipboard. Her fingers stained with foundation, probably from helping a bridesmaid with a last-minute panic. Isabelle Carter, I said. She scanned her list, paused, then frowned. Do you go by Isabel? No, it's Isabelle, with 2 L's and an E. She hesitated, flipping through laminated seating charts, then forced a smile. Well, we have you listed under Isabelle Carter. Table 19. That's on the east terrace, just off the kitchen patio. It's charming. Charming, right. I offered a tight smile and took the small gold envelope she handed me, which contained my table number and room assignment. The calligraphy on the envelope, supposedly done by a professional artist, spelled my name as Isabelle C. Not even my full name. And so it began. I walked through the halls passing familiar faces that barely registered mine. My mother's tennis partner waved vaguely. An uncle I hadn't seen in years offered a surprised, "Oh, you made it," I responded with the same faux warmth I'd been perfecting since puberty. Table 19 was exactly where she said it would be, shoved into a corner under a retractable tent near the staff entrance. The table was half set. A stack of folding chairs leaned against the wall beside it. The other guests hadn't arrived yet, but their name cards told me everything I needed to know. One read Daphne, flower girl age 7, another Mr. Nguyen, chauffeur, another still Mrs. Gladys Barnes, housekeeper retired. I sat down slowly, my heels sinking slightly into the sodden ground beneath the carpet. The floral arrangement in the center was smaller than the others I'd passed, wilting actually. A single tulip drooped over the side like even it had lost the will to participate. I watched the servers pass balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne flutes. I could hear laughter from the main hall, Victoria's laugh high and effortless like a flute played by wind. For a moment I considered walking in there, interrupting whatever pre-wedding fantasy she'd built around herself and asking her point blank, "Was this your doing?" But I already knew the answer. No one controlled seating arrangements at one of her events without her approval. And no one in our family dared override her, not even our mother. Speak of the devil, I spotted her across the courtyard directing a team of florists like a dictator overseeing a military parade. Her platinum hair was twisted into an elegant chignon, and her face, as always, was a portrait of perfection. Not a single line out of place, not even under the strain of controlling a 6-figure ceremony. I approached, carefully. "Mother." She turned slowly as if the sound of my voice were a language she hadn't heard in years. "Oh, Isabelle." Again with the name. It was like a paper cut every time. "I noticed there was a mistake on the seating chart," I began gently. "My name is spelled wrong, and—" She waved a manicured hand. "Oh, darling, don't worry about that. The calligrapher had 99 names to memorize. You can't expect perfection, except I could. And I did, because she expected it from me." And the table I pressed. She glanced down at her clipboard. 19. "Yes. You're not part of the bridal party or the immediate reception line, so we put you with the support staff. They know you, don't they?" I stared at her. "I'm your daughter." She blinked once, twice, then gave that tight, practiced smile, the one she used in country club interviews. "Yes, well, it's Victoria's Day, Isabelle. Try not to make things about you." She turned away before I could speak. Just turned, like a door closing without a sound. The air thickened. Somewhere nearby, a quartet began playing a string arrangement of Coldplay's Fix You. I almost laughed. I walked toward the main ballroom, letting my eyes sweep the grand space. Victoria stood under a cascade of orchids, surrounded by her bridesmaids, each in shades of champagne and rose gold, each tall, slender, and camera-ready. She was radiant, untouchable. Her white gown shimmered under the soft lights, hugging her figure like it had been grown from her skin. When she saw me, her expression didn't change, not 1 degree. I waited. A nod. A wave. A sister-to-sister smile. Nothing. Then after a beat too long, she turned her head slightly and muttered something to the girl next to her. Laughter. Dismissal. I wanted to shrink, but instead I stood taller. I wasn't angry. Not yet. But the seed had been planted, and it was already growing. I turned and walked back toward table 19, my heels striking the stone tiles in time with the music. If they wanted me forgotten, ignored, misplaced, then they would have to work harder. Because I was watching now, and unlike them, I didn't need to be the center of attention to change the entire story. The cocktail hour had barely begun when I first saw him, Connor Hale, the man who was supposedly marrying my sister for love. He stood by the grand piano in the west drawing room, swirling a glass of scotch he hadn't touched, flanked by 3 men in identical navy suits and identical indifferent expressions. He didn't look like a groom. He looked like a CEO waiting for a merger to finalize, and he was dressed accordingly. Crisp white collar, no tie, Dark gray vest over a hand-stitched shirt and shoes polished so viciously they reflected the stained glass light overhead like daggers. His eyes scanned the room, but not in the way people do when they're taking in a beautiful setting or greeting old friends. No, Connor's eyes moved like a surveillance camera. Mechanical, calculated. He wasn't observing. He was assessing. Victoria appeared beside him briefly, all glitter and grace, looping her arm around his, like a woman who believed in the fairy tale she was selling. He smiled down at her tight-lipped cold. Not a trace of warmth. It was the smile you give a stranger holding an elevator door. Then she kissed his cheek. He didn't even flinch. I stood at the edge of the room, partially hidden behind a column wrapped in eucalyptus and fairy lights. My half-empty champagne flute sweating in my hand. Maybe it was my job that made me so suspicious. Years of reading micro-expressions, decoding bloodless lies, parsing motive from posture. But something about Connor didn't fit. Not in the picturesque setting, and not in Victoria's perfectly crafted world. A flash caught my eye. One of the men near him, tall, dark-skinned, with a shaved head and a scar tracing the line of his jaw, adjusted his wristwatch. Nothing odd about that, except the way he did it, 3 quick taps on the bezel, followed by a subtle tilt upward toward the chandelier. I squinted. A faint green shimmer flickered over the lens. Glass. Gnome. That was a lens protector. The kind used to conceal miniature cameras. I blinked and looked away, heart ticking a little faster. Security detail, maybe? But they weren't wearing earpieces. No visible comms. No obvious hand signals. And if they were private security for Connor, why the covert tech? Why the nerves? Another man, this one blonde and younger, paced near the antique bookshelf, pretending to admire the leather-bound volumes. He wasn't reading titles. He was scanning watching doorways' windows, clocking exits. Too restless for a groomsman, too polished for a wedding planner, too observant to be a bored guest. I moved across the room, weaving through cliques of champagne laughter and perfume clouds. Near the fireplace, I pretended to admire a mural of a 19th-century fox hunt while angling my gaze toward Connor's group. He was talking now, not smiling. His mouth moved tightly, corners downward, tone low enough that I couldn't hear. But his posture told me everything. This wasn't celebratory. This was business. One of the suited men nodded subtly and peeled away. I turned just in time to catch a flicker of movement from behind a curtain. It was fast, just a shadow pulling back, but something in me snapped to attention. I followed instinct, not logic. I walked casually along the far edge of the room and stepped into the adjacent corridor, pretending to scroll my phone. And that's when it happened. A man mid-50s, thin, wire-rimmed glasses with a suit that didn't quite fit the mold, approached from the opposite end of the hallway. He moved with purpose, but his steps faltered when he saw me. Then he smiled, tight, cautious, and leaned in as we passed. "You're Isabelle Carter, aren't you?" I stopped, throat tightening. "Yes." He didn't offer a name, didn't extend a hand, just gave me a knowing look that turned my blood to ice. "Do you even know where you are right now?" I stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or call security. "I'm at my sister's wedding." He smiled again, but this time it wasn't polite. It was pitying. A fraction of a smirk that said, "You poor clueless thing." "No," he said, stepping back into the shadows. "You're at a transaction." Then he disappeared. Just gone. Slipped into one of the side rooms as if the hallway itself had swallowed him whole. I stood frozen for a second too long, my skin prickling under the satin of my dress. The clink of crystal and the muffled tones of the string quartet filtered through the heavy walls behind me. A transaction. The phrase buzzed in my head like a wasp. Not party, not wedding, not celebration. Transaction. I knew what that meant in my world. Deals, exchange, leverage, money. The kind of word whispered in courtrooms and crime scenes, not in castle courtyards beneath gold-trimmed chandeliers. I walked back into the drawing room, face calm, heart rattling in my chest. Connor was gone. So were two of his silent entourage. Victoria remained preening beneath the compliments of a senator's wife, laughing in her practiced, delicate tone. Oblivious, or maybe not, because when I passed her giving her a distant smile, her gaze locked with mine for a fraction of a second too long. Not in welcome, not in recognition, but in warning, and just like that I knew something was very, very wrong, and no one, least of all me, was supposed to notice. I only meant to find a bathroom. The main hall had grown louder, full of the metallic clink of cutlery and false laughter, echoing off centuries-old stone. I needed a break 5 minutes away from champagne flutes and white lies, the kind of silence that didn't try to smother you with pleasantries. A small hallway branched off from the library, dimly lit and lined with velvet portraits of past estate owners who all looked equally disdainful. I wandered down it, following a small plaque that read, "Restrooms." But somewhere along the way, the sign stopped and the carpet gave way to stone. That's when I saw the door. It was barely marked heavy oak, half swallowed by the wall's dark grain, with a brass knob so cold it stung. No placard, no sign, just a subtle emblem carved into the wood, a cluster of grapes wrapped in thorns. I assumed it was the wine cellar, or maybe a maintenance passage. But as I turned the knob, something in me stilled. That quiet primal pause in your blood when instinct whispers this wasn't meant for you. But I opened it anyway. The air changed immediately. Cool. Stale. It smelled of aged wood-damp earth and something sharper beneath metal, maybe. The door creaked open into darkness. I took a step in, then another. A soft click sounded behind me. When I turned back, the door had shut, and when I tried the knob, it didn't budge. I exhaled through my nose. Not panic. Not yet. The hallway had been long. Maybe there was some automatic locking mechanism, or maybe the frame had just settled out of alignment. Old buildings were moody like that. I turned back into the dark. My phone's flashlight pierced the black in a narrow beam, illuminating stone stairs that spiraled downward. I hesitated just for a breath and then descended. Each step felt like I was sinking deeper into someone else's secret. At the bottom was exactly what I'd expected, rows of dusty wine racks and old mahogany tasting table barrels stamped with vintage years. But something was wrong. The symmetry was off. One wall of racks extended farther than the others, pushed against the corner too tightly like it didn't belong. I moved closer. The rack was on wheels. I tested it with one hand. It rolled almost effortlessly, revealing another door, smaller steel-reinforced keypad beside the frame. But the keypad was lit. Someone had been down here recently. It shouldn't have been open, but it was. I pulled the handle. What I saw on the other side wasn't wine. It was an operation. The room was long and narrow, more like a vault than a chamber. Industrial lighting buzzed overhead, fluorescent and cold. Against one wall stood metal shelving stacked with lockboxes, external hard drives, file folders labeled with city names, Zurich, Macau, Cartagena, and numbers I didn't recognize but understood all too well, account codes. Money. At the center of the room was a table. Not just any table, this was surgical. Clean stainless steel. Spread across it were tablets, phones, piles of foreign currency, stacks of passports, each bearing a different name, but the same 3 faces. Connor, his dark-suited henchman from earlier, and a woman I didn't recognize. There was even a cash counting machine, its display frozen on 93,000. I felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. To my left, a computer was humming, screen still active. I stepped closer. It was paused on a video. I tapped the spacebar. Grainy surveillance footage flickered to life. A shipping container somewhere on a dock. Men moving crates. Labels in Russian. A white bag being unzipped. A long, pale brick of powder. Drugs, narcotics. The timestamp was from 2 weeks ago. I opened another folder. More video files. phone recordings, bank transactions, another folder internal transfers, Walker Financial. That stopped me cold. My father's firm. I clicked again, fingers numb. PDFs opened like wounds transfer logs, shell companies forged signatures. At least $4.2 million had moved through accounts I recognized. And at the center of every authorization, Connor Hale. It wasn't just laundering, it was embedded. I staggered backward. My heel knocked against something metal. A black duffel bag spilled open on the floor full of SIM cards, burner phones, and bricks of currency bound with rubber bands. This wasn't a cellar. This was a nerve center. This was a crime scene. And I had just walked into it with my name spelled wrong on the guest list and no one expecting me to ask questions. I backed away from the table. My breath was loud now, loud enough to betray me if anyone was near. I had to get out. Now. But before I could move, a shadow passed outside the small ventilation slit high on the wall. Someone was coming. I dropped behind the metal shelving phone tucked against my chest, fingers fumbling to silence the flashlight. Footsteps echoed above, casual, unhurried. Then a voice. "Room's clear. Secure it." A key code beeped. The outer door hissed shut, locked again, but they didn't check inside. Whoever it was, they assumed the room was empty. They hadn't seen me. Not yet. I counted to 30, then 60. Then, hot hammering, I crept back toward the wine rack. The shelving was on a sliding track it had locked from outside, but I found the latch on the interior side. I pulled it open just wide enough to squeeze through. Back into the wine cellar. Back up the stairs. When I reached the top, I tried the oak door again. This time it opened. The hallway was empty. I stepped back into the gilded hush of the castle and felt the weight of the secret settle like dust on my skin. This wasn't just a wedding. This was a cover-up, and I wasn't just the forgotten sister anymore. I was a witness. I had always known the value of evidence. Not just what you found, but how you handled it. How you preserved it. How you stayed invisible while everything inside you screamed. I pulled my phone from my clutch with shaking hands. My fingers moved on instinct camera, no flash, silent shutter. I began snapping. First, the documents, bank transfers, folder labels, the freeze frame of the video still playing on the desktop. I caught images of the shipping container numbers, the forged passports, the stack of burner phones. I opened drawers quickly, but carefully keeping the room exactly as I'd found it. That wasn't paranoia. That was protocol. Then I saw it, a small USB drive tucked under the keyboard. Black. No label. Tempting fate. I slipped it into the slit pocket sewn into the bodice of my gown. I could feel it pressing against my ribs as if it had its own heartbeat. I paused by the door, listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No low murmurs. Whoever had passed earlier was gone now, or at least far enough that I could move. I retraced my steps back through the wine racks, gently pulling the rolling shelf into place. The door at the top groaned a little louder this time, but it opened. The hallway was mercifully still empty, and just like that I was back in the gilded world again. A world of laughter and expensive perfume of high heels clicking against marble and strings playing Bach in some corner of the drawing room. Everything looked the same, sounded the same, but I wasn't the same. I pressed my hands flat against my gown to steady the quiver, rolled my shoulders back and forced my face into the mask I'd worn for years. The forgotten sister, the harmless guest. I walked back into the ballroom with my spine stiff and my mouth fixed into the kind of smile that didn't invite questions. The music had shifted into a slow waltz. Couples twirled under crystal chandeliers like nothing was wrong. Because to them, nothing was. I passed a server carrying a tray of oysters and grabbed a glass of water instead. My hands were still trembling, and I needed anything to ground myself. At my table, Daphne, the flower girl from earlier, was coloring in the corner of a children's activity menu. She looked up and beamed at me, gap-toothed and entirely unaware of the firestorm beneath the floorboards. "You were gone a long time," she said, cheerful. "Restrooms were hard to find," I replied, voice even. That was the truth, just not all of it. Connor wasn't in the room. Neither were the men in navy suits. Victoria was holding court near the dance floor, surrounded by a circle of women in designer gowns laughing too loudly at nothing at all. I stared at her for a beat. She looked radiant, untouchable. Her left hand rested delicately on her stomach, a subtle display of the engagement ring that had started this entire theater. I wondered if she had any idea who she was marrying, if she suspected the truth, or worse, if she already knew. I took another sip of water and glanced toward the ballroom doors. I needed air. I needed time to think. But mostly I needed help. That night, back in the suite, the family had assigned me top floor barely larger than a broom closet, with a view of a brick wall. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the USB like a talisman. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I didn't need them. The darkness made it easier to dial the number. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 2 years. Not since Quantico. Not since everything got complicated and he got transferred and I chose the clean exit. I didn't even know if the number still worked. But when the line picked up on the third ring and that voice said my name like a warning wrapped in concern, I almost cried. Isabelle. Hi, Nick. He was quiet for a second. Then it's been a while. Yeah, I breathed. I need to ask you something. And I need you to not interrupt until I'm done, okay? You're scaring me. I'm scaring myself. And then I told him. Everything. I told him about the cellar, the surveillance videos, the foreign accounts, the internal transfers labeled Walker Financial. I described the passports, the drugs, the presence of Connor's men moving like shadows through the wedding. I told him about the USB and the documents I'd seen, and I didn't sugarcoat any of it. When I finished, there was silence. Then Jesus Christ, Isabelle. I know. Do you still have the USB? I do. Okay. He was pacing. I could hear it in the rhythm of his breath. You said this guy's name is Connor Hale. Yes. Why does that sound familiar? He trailed off, muttering something to someone on his end. A keyboard clattered. Shit, he said. What? I've seen this name. Interagency brief came through last month. Task force flagged it. Hale's connected to at least 3 shell cores. We don't have anything concrete yet, but we suspect he's a front, possibly a broker for a syndicate that runs through Cartagena and Macau. Then what I saw was real. Isabelle, he said, voice lower now, what you saw might be the key to blowing this thing open. I closed my eyes. I don't want to blow anything open. I just want to keep Victoria safe. She might not be clean in this. I know. Silence. Then softly. You're not going back down there, are you? No, not tonight. Good. I'm sending a secure drop link. Upload what you have. I'll have cyber forensics dig into it first thing in the morning. But Isabelle, listen to me, don't trust anyone at that venue. Not the staff, not the guests, not even your sister. I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure I disagreed. I'll call you in 6 hours, he continued. If anything changes, if you feel like you're being followed, if anyone asks questions, get out. I can't leave, not yet. Why? Because tomorrow she walks down the aisle. And if what I saw means what I think it does, she might not walk back. I ended the call. Then I leaned back into the darkness, the USB warm against my skin. Tomorrow would be a reckoning. And this time, I wouldn't be invisible. I barely slept. The USB sat on the desk across from me like it was humming, vibrating with secrets too dangerous to stay buried. I'd uploaded the contents to the encrypted drive Nick sent me, then spent the next 2 hours combing through what I could access myself. There were hundreds of files, hundreds, but I wasn't just looking for evidence of crime. I was looking for connection, for motive, for the thin, trembling thread that would lead me from Connor Hale's offshore labyrinth back to the marble corridors of the Carter family estate. It didn't take long. The first clue was a spreadsheet labeled Accounts, Q3 Reallocation Plan Preliminary. The innocuous name belied its contents, rows upon rows of fund movement, cross-referenced with shell corporations I recognized from the earlier folder. At least 6 companies listed had wire transfers in the millions, dates aligning perfectly with photos I'd taken in the vault. One name appeared over and over: Walker Hale Strategic Holdings. It wasn't a name I knew, but it wasn't hard to deconstruct. Walker, our mother's maiden name. And Hale, of course, was Connor. I cross-checked that entity with tax IDs and property registries. The trail led to a real estate holding firm in Boston's financial district, registered just 8 months ago. CEO Victoria Walker Hale. My stomach dropped. I clicked through the registration docs, and there it was, Victoria's signature. Real. Legally binding. She wasn't just marrying Connor, she was already in business with him. Publicly. But that wasn't the part that made my blood run cold. No. It was the line marked Initial Capital Investment. $12,000 sourced from Carter Family Trust. My trust, my father's, all of it. I scrolled back through our family's financial records, most of which I'd memorized years ago after watching my mother juggle estates like she was hosting tea parties. The numbers didn't lie. We were bleeding. Liquid assets had been diverted, property mortgaged. A once stable foundation, my father's hard-earned portfolio slowly cannibalized under the guise of venture reinvestment. And it wasn't failing because of bad market timing. It was failing because of Connor. The deal they'd sunk everything into was laundering money through property flips in Macau and Buenos Aires. Walker Hale wasn't a real estate firm. It was a shell pipeline, a glossy, photoshopped pipe dream dressed up to fool investors who craved elite access and international prestige. Connor had sold them the dream, and Victoria had sold herself to keep it afloat. I leaned back, a weight settling deep in my ribs. She wasn't marrying him because she loved him. She was marrying him because she was trapped. And Mom, she'd let it happen. I found the proof in a flagged email chain tucked in one of the USB's subfolders. Forwarded messages between Connor and someone using an anonymized domain discussing visibility optics, bridal publicity, and the timeline of the merger. It was signed D. Walker, my mother. There were attached screenshots of wedding dress drafts, guest list feedback, press release coordination, and then a sentence that stole the air from my lungs. Ensure Isabelle's placement is discreet. She's not a priority. Not a priority. Not even a person. I stood up from the desk and walked to the window, staring down at the courtyard, now asleep beneath its winter sky. The castle was cloaked in quiet fairy lights still flickering from the wedding tent like nothing had changed. But everything had. My mother had always been elegant, efficient, ruthless in her pursuit of perfection. She wore her legacy like armor and wielded Victoria's fame like a weapon. But I'd never thought, even at my most cynical, that she would knowingly marry her daughter off to a criminal just to rescue the family's fortune, that she would silence the warnings, bury the truth, strip Victoria of choice under the guise of duty. But it all made sense now, the way she handled me, the way she ignored my questions about the table, the envelope, the misspelled name. I wasn't an oversight. I was a threat. She'd worked so hard to craft the Carter family myth. Smart, beautiful Victoria, with her camera-ready smile, philanthropic endorsements, and perfect pedigree. And Isabelle, the quiet one, the science-obsessed sister who never needed to be in the frame. I was perfect background, easy to control, until I wasn't, until I found the vault, the money, the truth, until I realized that my mother had already sold us all. And that Victoria, she was bleeding under all that lace, because now I could see it even in memory. Her hesitation during fittings, the slightly hollow way she smiled when guests fawned over Connor, the way she held her breath when he entered a room. That wasn't love. That was fear dressed up in designer silk. I returned to the screen, eyes narrowing at a final message marked urgent. It was a reply from Connor to my mother dated just 3 days ago. If there's any hint of exposure, we pull the plug. No wedding, no merger. If she talks, you take care of it. I'll handle damage control on my end. No wedding, no merger. Take care of it. My hands clenched. They were ready to walk away if needed, ready to ruin Victoria if she broke rank. And my mother was complicit in it all. She hadn't just ignored the danger. She'd endorsed it. I closed the laptop. Sat there in the dark for a long while, and in the silence something inside me hardened. Not anger, not vengeance. Resolve. They had built this empire on secrets and silence. But I knew better. Silence doesn't protect. It only delays collapse. And tomorrow, when Victoria stood under a vaulted ceiling, wearing a $30,000 gown and holding the hand of a man who could bankrupt nations, she'd have a choice. But so would I. Let it happen, or finally be seen. And this time, I wouldn't be quiet. It's strange how clarity doesn't always arrive like a lightning strike. Sometimes it crawls toward you in silence, slow, suffocating until it's so close you can feel its breath on your skin. That's how it felt the moment I knew I couldn't walk away from this. The USB had done its damage. The files had names, dates, bank codes, and signatures. I had digital proof. Now I needed a real-world consequence. By 3:12 a.m. I had made my decision. I called Nick again. He picked up on the first ring voice, rough from sleep but sharp the second he heard my tone. "They're planning something tomorrow," I said. "It's not just a ceremony. It's a transfer of power, an image. Connor's consolidating. If he marries Victoria, it legitimizes everything. Then we need to stop it." "No," I corrected him. "We need to ruin it." There was a pause. "Then tell me what you're thinking." So I did. We built it piece by piece. It had to be airtight, unignorable, and fast. Connor wasn't just laundering money, he was buying silence, masking criminal enterprise in the illusion of elite respectability. This wedding was a media event. Half the guests were either on Forbes lists or had PACs named after them. Public exposure meant accountability. At least more than a quiet indictment behind closed doors ever could. Nick agreed. "Can we get agents on site?" I asked. "We'll have a tactical team within 15 miles. You give the signal, they move in. But Isabelle, you have to be sure. We screw this up, it's not just your sister's reputation on the line. We're talking international fallout." "I'm sure," I said. I've never been more sure. We hung up with a single code phrase. Detour at the aisle. It would trigger the operation. The phrase had to be spoken within earshot of Victoria and Connor. A clear, confirmable signal that the wedding was compromised and the bride or groom wouldn't make it to I do. I wasn't finished yet. I needed a failsafe, because I didn't trust the system to protect me if it all went sideways. If Connor caught wind of the raid, if my mother got cold feet and started deleting files, if Nick's team got delayed or overruled, I needed something louder than a badge. So I went back to my laptop and drafted the email. Subject: the truth about the Walker-Hale wedding. Recipients: a curated list of journalists, bloggers, financial watchdogs, and media outlets. Every reporter who'd ever covered a white-collar scandal, every podcast host who'd ever dissected a political downfall. Attached were the key documents: account transfers, ownership records, screenshots from the vault. Connor's messages to my mother, the incorporation paperwork bearing Victoria's signature. I added 2 folders, one labeled Carter Family Trust, Breach, and another Walker-Hale equals money laundering front. I wrote, "If you're receiving this, it means the story broke too late. The truth was hidden in plain sight. The names are real. The evidence is attached. This is not a leak. This is justice. Isabelle Carter." I scheduled it for 2:15 p.m., the exact moment Victoria and Connor were meant to exchange vows, unless I stopped it first. I stared at the screen for a long time, finger hovering over the confirm button. Then I hit it. The timer began counting down. I sat back exhausted, but still not done. Because there was one more thing I needed. Not data, not documents. Voice. It came to me like a flash, a moment I'd half forgotten. Earlier that day, I'd walked past one of the smaller parlors near the east wing. The door had been slightly ajar, and I'd heard voices inside, low, tense, feminine. At the time, I'd kept walking. Too overwhelmed, too numb. But now I remembered the tone, the crack in Victoria's voice. I needed that, so I backtracked. It was past 4 in the morning, but the castle never really slept. A few servers moved quietly through the halls. A couple of bridesmaids had crashed on chaise lounges in the main suite, still in full makeup, one heel kicked off tiara askew. I returned to the parlor. Empty. But the light on the security panel blinked green. "Recording enabled." This was a high-security wing of the estate. Nick had told me these systems often recorded sound as well as video, especially in properties used for high-profile events. I slipped behind the reception desk near the kitchen and accessed the system. It took some coaxing, bluffing a surname and flashing a staff pass I'd pocketed earlier, but eventually I was in. The footage was segmented by room and time. I selected the parlor, scroll back. There, 1:48 p.m. Audio active. I pressed play. Victoria's voice came through broken and fraying. "He's lying to you, Mom. He's not what you think." My mother cold-clipped. "You don't get to back out now. Not after everything we've risked." "Risked, you mean lost. He's using us. He's restoring us. I can't marry a criminal." "You can and you will." There was a pause. Then Victoria again quieter. "I won't say yes. Not at the altar." My mother. "Then you'd better learn how to say goodbye. Because if he walks, everything falls." That was enough. I downloaded the audio. Victoria wasn't blind. She wasn't innocent, but she wasn't in control either. She'd been boxed in, branded, and sold by the same woman who'd spent her entire life orchestrating appearances. Now I had her voice. The final thread. I backed out of the system, wiped the access log, and slipped away. Back in my room, I transferred the recording to Nick. Marked it as final trigger-proof. He didn't need to respond. We both knew what it meant. Then I sat in the dark, watching the sunrise bleed into the sky, turning the frost-covered branches into glass. The castle was waking, and so was I. Tomorrow I wouldn't whisper anymore. I had the truth, and I had a plan. The bridal suite smelled like jasmine and ambition. It was nearly noon, and light spilled in through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting soft gold over velvet chairs, garment bags, and open makeup cases. Stylists buzzed around like bees in a hive, curling irons hissing false lashes, fluttering highlighters glinting. Hairspray hung thick in the air, clinging to the marble like anxiety. I lingered at the edge of the room, just inside the door, unseen as usual. Then I saw her. Victoria stood barefoot in front of the mirror, draped in white silk and silence. The gown clung to her like smoke, strapless, cinched at the waist, a train that spilled behind her like a surrendered flag. Her hair was pinned into a low chignon, soft tendrils falling loose around her face. A veil waited nearby, untouched. For a moment I forgot the USB drive, forgot the recordings, forgot Connor's name and the vault and the offshore accounts, forgot the bloodless betrayal mapped in PDFs. She looked young, almost scared. Then she noticed me. Her reflection met mine in the mirror, and something flickered in her eyes, surprise maybe. Then it vanished behind the smile she wore like a shield. "You came," she said. The words were so simple they shouldn't have meant anything, but they hit like a fist. "I'm your sister," I replied, my voice barely carrying over the rustle of satin. "Of course I came." She turned slowly, the fabric whispering across the floor. And for the first time in years, Victoria Carter, soon to be Hale, looked at me like I was real. "I wasn't sure you would." My throat tightened. Neither was I. There was a pause, then softly, "Thank you." 2 words. That's all. But from her they felt foreign, almost sacred. My sister didn't say thank you. She didn't say please. She floated through life on the assumption that presence was enough. But here now she looked human, tired, haunted. "You look—" I began, then stopped. What could I say? Beautiful, radiant. Exactly like a woman about to make the worst mistake of her life. She saved me the effort, like a hostage in couture. I blinked. A beat passed. Then we both laughed quietly but sincerely. I wasn't going to say that I said. "But it's true," she replied. I studied her face, the slight bruise under her concealer, the tremble in her lower lip. I hadn't noticed it before, masked under the pageantry. But now, in this quiet hour, I saw it. "Fear. You don't have to go through with it," I whispered. Her eyes flicked to the closed door, then back to mine. "You think I haven't told myself that every day for a month? Then walk. Get in a car, get on a plane. Go anywhere." "I can't." "Yes, you can." She shook her head suddenly, not the poised bride, but a girl drowning under pressure she was never built to survive. "You don't know what he's capable of, Izzy." "I do," I said. I know exactly what he's capable of. Her gaze sharpened. I held it. Then I stepped forward, just close enough that no one could overhear, and in a voice barely above a whisper I said, "I've seen the accounts. I've seen the videos, the cash, the shell companies, the fake passports." She paled. "Jesus," she whispered. "I know what he is. And I know what he's done. And I know you're not the only one who's afraid of him." Her jaw clenched. "If you say anything, he'll—" "I'm not here to ruin your life, Victoria," I said. "I'm here to save it." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. "I know about the trust," I continued. "About Walker Hale Holdings. About the $12 million Mom siphoned into that company." Her knees buckled slightly and she gripped the edge of the vanity. "You don't understand," she breathed. "I do. I understand more than you think." I looked at her then, not as the girl who stole the spotlight, or the woman who'd learned to survive by becoming everything our parents demanded, but as a sister. A flawed, frightened sister standing on the edge of a cliff in high heels and lipstick. "You were never the villain, V," I said. "You were the sacrifice." Tears welled in her eyes, mascara already clumping at the edges. She swiped at her cheek, but didn't bother fixing it. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "Then why did you stay?" "Because if I didn't, the entire family would collapse." "It already has," I said. "You just haven't seen it yet." Silence fell between us like snowfall, and in that silence something inside me cracked, not out of pity, but clarity. She wasn't clean, but she wasn't the architect. She had been maneuvered, pressured, leveraged. Still, she had chosen to sign the papers. Still, she had walked toward the fire. I couldn't undo that, and I couldn't stop what was coming. The agents were already nearby. The email countdown had passed the halfway mark. And every second we stood here pretending this was salvageable was 1 second closer to detonation. I wanted to tell her to run, to scream, to fight. But she didn't need a sister who begged her to be brave. She needed one who was. So I stepped back. "You still have a choice," I said. She met my eyes, red-rimmed, weary, but finally honest. "I don't know if I can make it." "You already did," I said, "when you said you didn't want this." And with that I turned and walked out. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared enough to let it hurt. The courtyard had been transformed into something out of a royal fantasy, an opulent dream so delicate it looked as though a single gust of wind might shatter it. A silk canopy arched overhead draped in soft white fabric that fluttered in the late spring breeze. Hundreds of white orchids spiraled from marble columns climbing like whispers toward the sky. Rows of gold-backed chairs stretched in perfect symmetry down a carpeted aisle flanked by manicured hedges, harpists and guests who smelled like money and wore it even louder. They had come in droves. Boston's elite, New York's politicians, West Coast influencers and foreign dignitaries with surnames that came with legacies. Phones clicked, champagne poured, laughter tinkled like cut glass. And at the center of it all was the altar, an elevated marble platform beneath a floral arch that reportedly cost more than my college tuition. I stood in the last row shaded by a sycamore tree. My dress was simple navy blue again, my mother's favorite color for rendering me invisible. It worked. No one noticed me. No one ever did. Until today. The music began. A quartet played something that tried to sound classical, but carried undertones of pop elegance for show. The guests turned collectively inhaling as the procession began. First came the bridesmaids, one by one, glowing in uniform in blush-toned gowns that shimmered like rose gold. Then the flower girl Daphne scattering petals with all the enthusiasm of a child bribed with cake. Then came Victoria. She appeared at the far end of the aisle, arm hooked into my father's. Her veil trailed behind her like a river of silk. From a distance she looked poised, perfect, composed. But I saw it, the tremble in her wrist, the clenched jaw, the micro-winch in her smile that betrayed the war beneath her skin. Connor stood at the altar, flanked by groomsmen who looked more like a security detail than friends. His expression didn't shift. He didn't blink. He simply watched her like a man assessing inventory. The air thickened with heat and tension. Victoria ascended the steps. She took her place. The music faded. The officiant, a man flown in from some private theological institute in Geneva, stepped forward, his robe blindingly white in the midday sun. "Dearly beloved," he began, "we are gathered here today to celebrate the union of two extraordinary souls." I didn't hear the rest, because all I could focus on was the countdown in my head. 2:13. 2 minutes. Victoria's hand twitched slightly in Connor's grasp. I recognized that look in her eyes now. It wasn't fear anymore. It was awareness. She knew what was coming, and still she stood there. The officiant cleared his throat. "Connor Hale, do you take Victoria Walker to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Connor's lips parted, and then, "Excuse me?" The voice rang out like a thunderclap, sharp and masculine, cutting through the perfumed hush like a blade. Heads turned. Guests craned their necks. "Federal agents!" another voice shouted from the side lawn. Suddenly movement exploded from every corner of the courtyard. Men in dark tactical gear stormed the periphery. Some emerging from behind the hedges, others stepping out of catering tents or security posts. Guests gasped. Some screamed. One woman dropped her phone. "Don't move," an agent barked, weapon drawn but lowered. Connor froze. Then, like a man who'd rehearsed this moment in nightmares, he turned fast, precise, toward the nearest exit. But 3 agents blocked him before he could take a single step. Hands in the air. He didn't obey. Instead, he reached into his jacket. A collective scream erupted, but the agent was faster. 1 second. That's all it took. Connor was forced down, arms behind his back, face in the grass, cuffed with brutal efficiency. Victoria didn't move. She stood like stone, eyes wide, lips parted, veil rustling. Another agent stepped up to the platform. "Victoria Walker, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit financial fraud, aiding and abetting money laundering, and obstruction of justice." Gasps turned to chaos. "No." My mother's voice, sharp, breathless, somewhere near the front. She stood up, wobbled, then crumpled against the side of her chair. "Mom," someone shouted, but no one moved to catch her. The crowd scattered, heels clacking, voices rising, cameras rolling. I stood still, frozen, watching. Victoria didn't resist. As agents cuffed her wrists in front of her, she looked out over the courtyard, and then her eyes found me, not with rage, not with panic, but with something quiet, resigned. She nodded once, and for the first time in our lives I nodded back. My father stood unmoving, jaw slack, staring at his daughter like he didn't recognize her. My mother lay in the arms of a bridesmaid, half-conscious, face pale. Connor was already being led away. Victoria followed, and as they vanished through the hedge-lined corridor, the illusion shattered behind them. The altar remained, flowers trembling in the breeze, but the performance was over, and the truth at last had taken center stage. The ballroom had been cleared. Guests had either left in a rush or been ushered into holding areas. The waitstaff stood huddled near the service entrance, whispering. The quartet's instruments had long gone silent, abandoned like soldiers retreating from a war they weren't trained to fight. And in the center of it all, under the same chandelier, where they were supposed to share their first dance, stood Victoria and Connor, no longer bride and groom but suspects. The marble floor echoed with the sharp clicks of agents' boots. Equipment cases slammed open. Cables snaked across velvet carpets. Laptops flickered to life as agents unpacked evidence, uploading, verifying, connecting. Connor was seated in a Louis XVI chair that looked absurd under his handcuffed frame. His tie had been removed. His hair had begun to fall, the product fading, revealing the tension at his temples. He still looked confident. Too confident. Victoria, on the other hand, was unraveling. She sat beside him, still in the wedding gown. But now it hung off her shoulders like a costume 3 acts past its prime. Her makeup had streaked, her lip quivered, her posture was collapsing in slow motion. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this." An agent glanced at her but said nothing. Victoria looked around, her eyes wild, and then she turned toward my mother, who had regained consciousness and was now seated nearby, flanked by 2 agents, and my father, who looked as though someone had cracked his chest open and removed something vital. "You did this!" Victoria hissed, rising halfway before stumbling on the train of her dress. "You told me I had to do it, that we had no choice. Victoria, my mother began, voice thin, uncertain. You said we were out of time, that this wedding was the only way to secure the capital. It was my mother said weakly, trying to compose herself. You were already involved, darling. You signed the papers. It was damage control. I was 26, Victoria screamed. I didn't understand what I was signing. You handed me a document and told me it was for branding, that it was about leverage, not laundering. She broke then. Her knees buckled, and the sound that came from her wasn't sobbing. It was something raw. A keening sound of betrayal so deep it sounded like it came from the soles of her feet. I didn't want this, she cried. I didn't want him. Connor shifted in his seat, finally smirking. Careful, sweetheart, he drawled. You don't want to paint yourself too innocent. We both know where your signature lives. Shut up, Victoria whispered. You think they're going to save you? He said, nodding at the agents. These people don't care about you. They care about convictions, headlines, optics. They'll throw you under the bus so fast you won't even see the bumper. He turned, then gaze sweeping toward my mother. But you, he added, smirk, sharpening into something cruel. You're the real story. Darlene Walker, society icon, matriarch of the Carter legacy, moving dirty money through a trust fund. That's front page gold. Don't you dare! My mother snapped, but her voice cracked before it landed. I've got backups, Connor continued. Emails, calls, signed contracts, video. You think I built all this without leverage? You son of a— Save it! He leaned back, metal cuffs rattling. If I go down, I'm taking all of you with me. One of the lead agents stepped forward, then cutting through the tension with the kind of authority only law enforcement could summon in a room full of people used to being above the law. Mr. Hale, she said, calm and firm, you are being charged with conspiracy to commit financial crimes, international money laundering, and racketeering. You are under federal investigation as a primary node in a multinational criminal enterprise with links to entities in Macau, Zurich, Bogota, and Dubai. Connor's smirk faltered slightly. The scope of your operation, she continued, is still unfolding. We have reason to believe you've worked with political proxies, shell corporations, and fraudulent charities. You used Walker Hale Strategic Holdings to funnel dirty money through real estate acquisitions, event sponsorships, and even this wedding. Gasps rippled across the room, soft but sharp. The agent turned toward Victoria now. Ms. Walker, you are currently under detainment for aiding and abetting. The degree of your involvement will determine the severity of your charges. If you have material evidence that clarifies your position, now would be the time to share it. Victoria opened her mouth, closed it, then looked at me. There was no pride left in her gaze, no pretense. Just a silent question. What happens now? I stepped forward. She tried to get out, I said. I have an audio recording. Last night, she told our mother she didn't want to marry him. She said she couldn't go through with it. The agent's eyes met mine. Who are you? Isabelle Carter. Her sister. The one who found the vault. The one who tipped your field office. Another pause, then a nod. We'll need a formal statement. You'll get it, Connor scoffed. Oh, please, he muttered. Little sister steps out of the shadows, finally gets her spotlight. How quaint. I don't need the spotlight, I said, voice steady. Just the truth. And in that moment, I saw him for what he really was. Not untouchable, not elegant, not strategic. Just a man in a stolen suit with no more cards left to play. A con artist whose curtain had finally dropped. The ballroom was silent again. But this silence was different. Heavier. Truth-laden. Victoria wept quietly. My mother said nothing. My father stood like stone. And I stood at the center of the storm I had helped unleash. Not as the forgotten daughter, but as the one who finally said enough. The door shut with a muted click behind me, muffling the distant chaos of agents and murmuring staff, the hush of scandal wrapping itself around the castle like a second layer of insulation. The private lounge just off the bridal suite was meant for quiet reflection, champagne and touch-ups before a grand entrance. Instead, it was where everything came undone. Victoria sat curled on the edge of a velvet fainting couch, still in her wedding gown. Wrinkled now, streaked with tears and dust, the bodice slightly askew where her arms had been cuffed and released. Her hands trembled in her lap, clasped tight, white-knuckled. Her mascara had run to her cheekbones. No one had offered her a tissue. Our mother stood near the fireplace, pacing in short, stiff strides. One hand clasped tightly around her phone, though she hadn't looked at the screen in several minutes. The signal was lost. Or maybe she knew no one was coming to save her anymore. I stood in the center unmoving. No one spoke. Not yet. Finally, Victoria's voice broke the silence. Small. Raw. Are they going to charge me? My mother didn't answer. She just kept pacing. They're evaluating, I said gently. You'll have to cooperate. Fully. Victoria nodded. She blinked hard. Okay. Then she looked up at our mother. You told me I was safe. You said I was insulated. Mother didn't look at her. You were. No, I wasn't. Victoria snapped, her voice rising. I was named. I was married on paper to that man. I signed the accounts, the filings. You pushed me into this. I didn't push. Mother hissed, finally stopping. I protected. By selling me off, she said. By parading me like a solution to a family deficit. You don't understand. Mother snapped, and the sharpness in her tone was brittle now, cracking at the edges. You both think this is about greed or vanity, but it wasn't, it never was. She turned to me then. It was about survival. I stared at her, incredulous. Survival. Yes, she said. You think this life sustains itself? You think reputation is a fountain that never runs dry? It's earned. Every handshake, every event, every name whispered in the right room. It all has weight. And your father and I built this house brick by brick with that weight. And when it started to crumble, I said you used your daughter as mortar. Silence. You don't know what it's like to watch everything you've built, every legacy, every asset begin to dissolve, she whispered. Connor came with a solution. Victoria was already in. The partnership was clean, legal. The marriage sealed it. Clean, I said. There was nothing clean about it. She flinched. Her hand clenched around her phone again. You had options, I said. You could have asked for help. You could have stepped back, sold something, faced the truth. But you didn't. Because truth doesn't protect you in our world, she cried. It stains you. It follows you. We would have lost everything. The press, the board, the country club. To hell with the country club, I snapped. You lost us. Victoria wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. Our mother took a breath, but I wasn't done. You want to talk about survival. Let's talk about mine, I said. I've spent years swallowing invisibility while you staged every scene around Victoria, every smile, every headline, every damn seating chart. You never meant to see me, I said, because I didn't fit your aesthetic. I didn't care about cameras or curated Instagram feeds. I didn't want to be admired, I wanted to be honest. And you didn't know what to do with that. My mother looked down, something shifting behind her eyes. Maybe shame. Maybe the beginning of it. I didn't choose to be the center, Victoria whispered. I just figured out how to stay there. I turned to her. I know. I envied you, she said. Her voice shook. Not because you were outside of it, but because you weren't beholden to it. The room quieted. I watched you graduate without anyone clapping and still stand tall. I watched you get overlooked and never shrink. I didn't know how to do that. Her lip trembled. I'm sorry, Isabelle. The world stopped for a beat. It was the first time she had ever said it. I didn't know how much I'd needed to hear those words until I did. I'm sorry for letting them pit us against each other, she went on, for making you feel like a shadow. You didn't make me, I said. But you never reached in to pull me out either. I'm reaching now. Tears welled in my eyes, sudden and uninvited. I nodded once. I see you, V. She nodded too. And then my mother, quiet now, sat down heavily in a nearby chair. She stared at nothing for a long time. Then I was trying to protect our name. I looked at her. No venom, just tired truth. Then you forgot to protect your daughters. She didn't argue. She just sat there defeated, wrapped in the consequences of her own design. And I realized then, this wasn't justice. This was the reckoning, and we were all still breathing. The headlines came first. They appeared slowly at first. Then all at once, like a dam had burst, and the truth was flooding every corner of the elite circles that had once protected people like my family from consequences. By Monday morning, the Boston Herald ran a full front-page spread. The wedding that wasn't Carter heiress, implicated in international money laundering scandal, and underneath a photo of Victoria caught mid-sob in a torn wedding gown, her wrists still faintly reddened from the cuffs. I watched from the window of my Somerville apartment, the morning news flickering silently across the television behind me. I didn't need the sound. The crawl at the bottom said it all. Sources confirm Victoria Walker Hale cooperating as key witness in Hale syndicate case. Not a suspect anymore. A witness. After 3 days in federal custody, Victoria had agreed to turn everything over paperwork. Personal records, encrypted messages stored in cloud folders she hadn't even told our mother about. She told the truth, most of it, and in return the FBI cut her a deal. No formal charges, no prison time, but she would never be a public figure again. The modeling contracts evaporated. Sponsorships pulled out. A major cosmetics brand archived every ad she'd ever appeared in within hours of the press conference. Her face vanished from billboards like she'd never existed, but she was free. And for the first time in her life she was fully herself. Meanwhile, our mother was not so lucky. The feds moved fast. Within the week, subpoenas were issued. Her private accounts were frozen. The Carter Foundation, our family's nonprofit legacy, was stripped of its tax-exempt status, pending full investigation. A lifetime of curated relationships, careful networking, and power lunch influence collapsed in a matter of days. I heard through a friend that the board of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts voted to remove her from the chairperson list in a closed session that lasted under 7 minutes. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She simply stopped attending things, stopped being seen. And in a town like Boston, absence is exile. Our name became shorthand for scandal, no longer whispered with envy at charity galas or school fundraisers. Now it was the punchline in think pieces, case studies, whispered lectures in Ivy League law classes. But me, I became a different kind of name. At first I resisted the interviews, the morning shows, the offers from publishing houses and podcast hosts begging me to tell your truth. I wasn't interested in attention, not the artificial kind, not the temporary spotlight that disappears the moment someone trendier makes a louder mess. But then I realized something. Silence is what let this happen in the first place. So I spoke. First in court testimony, sworn and structured and deliberate. I sat across from Connor's defense team and looked them in the eye when I described what I found. The vault, the transfers, the emails with my mother's signature. I didn't flinch. Then I spoke to the press not as a scandalized socialite or dramatic younger sister, but as a trained investigator. A woman with credentials. A woman who knew the system and was unafraid to name what broke inside it. And people listened. By the second week, I'd been asked to speak at 2 panels about ethics in financial crime investigations. A third request came from a university I never thought would know my name. Not Harvard, but Northeastern. My school, my merit, my journey. One article called me the unlikely heroine who saved a city's moral compass. Another said I was a modern Cassandra who refused to be ignored. Flattering, a little excessive. But still I printed that one, framed it. Victoria texted me the link the day it ran. Just a single line. You always saw clearer than the rest of us. That meant more than any headline. Still, I didn't let it go to my head, because fame was never my goal. The day after the story broke nationwide, I got a voicemail from a woman in Missouri. She said she worked in compliance at a nonprofit and had uncovered irregularities, embezzlement from within, but every time she raised it, she was silenced. She saw my story, she said, and it gave her the courage to try again. That I printed too. I pinned it to my bulletin board at work, because that was what mattered. Not the news cycle, not the viral shares, but the fact that someone else, another woman in the margins, had decided she was worth being heard. And as for the Carter family name, it would never mean what it once did. But I had finally redefined what it meant to be a Carter. Not curated, not cold, but clear, real, and most of all, true. The hallway smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. I stood outside the glass doors of my old office, hand hovering over the access panel. My badge was newly reissued, the lamination still stiff corners untouched. The last time I'd walked this corridor, I was someone else. Someone smaller. Someone whose voice got stuck in her throat. Today I swiped in without hesitation. Carter. A familiar voice broke the silence. Agent Nina Reyes, head of internal analytics. She stood near the bullpen, one brow raised, arms folded, expression amused but not unkind. I smiled. Back for more punishment, I said. She laughed. Or maybe you finally realized we needed you. I walked through the rows of cubicles, heads turning a few nods, some warm smiles. No fanfare, but no shadow either. I wasn't the invisible one anymore. Nina followed me into the briefing room. They want you to lead the Hail Aftermath initiative, she said, sliding a manila folder across the table. We're partnering with 3 agencies: financial crimes, cyber forensics, international fraud. You'll be the liaison. Full autonomy. I opened the folder. Case structure, personnel lists, operational budget, my name on top. Lead investigator, I whispered. She nodded. You earned it. I didn't say thank you, not because I wasn't grateful, but because those words felt too small. Instead, I simply exhaled. A long, slow breath that felt like something leaving my body, something I'd been carrying for years. After the chaos, after the spotlight, after the collapse, this was what remained. My work, my mind, my purpose, and peace. Not loud, not showy, just present. Back home, the apartment was quiet. I liked it that way. The city hummed outside the windows, but inside was stillness, clean surfaces, books in stacks, candles half burned. I shed the blazer, rolled up my sleeves, and made tea. That's when I saw the envelope. Cream-colored, no return address. My name written in cursive, familiar, looping, elegant. Victoria. I hesitated before opening it. Inside 2 pages written by hand. Izzy, I've tried to write this letter 5 times. None of them sounded right. Maybe that's the problem. I've always said the right thing instead of the real thing. So here it is. The real thing. I'm sorry. For the years I played the favorite without questioning it. For the ways I treated your silence as weakness. For pretending not to notice how much I relied on your strength to stand. I'm in therapy now. Twice a week. It's awful and necessary, and I'm finally understanding how much I let our mother define me. I'm trying to unlearn. It's harder than I thought. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not even asking for it. I just wanted you to know I see you now. Love, Victoria. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and slid it into the drawer beside my bed, not to forget, but to keep close. Not as a clean slate, but as proof that people can choose differently even if too late. Later that evening, I took a long walk through the South End. The trees were blooming. Storefronts glowed. A father pushed a stroller past me, humming off-key. I passed a group of students debating something in French, their hands animated, their laughter reckless. Life was moving again, and so was I. The ache hadn't disappeared, but it had softened. No longer sharp, no longer a wound to wince from. Just something woven into me now. A thread of pain, yes, but also survival. I thought about forgiveness, how it's always marketed like a gift we give someone else. But I had learned the truth. Forgiveness isn't about them. It's about freedom. It's about letting go of the tether between you and the past so you can move forward without dragging every broken piece behind you. Victoria didn't deserve my forgiveness, but I deserved to stop bleeding, and that was enough. At home, I lit a candle, poured a 2nd cup of tea, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a shadow standing at the edge of someone else's story. I felt real, whole, home. Saturday mornings used to feel like echoes empty, slow ghosted by obligations I never signed up for. Brunches I wasn't invited to, calls that never came. It was a rhythm of absence, the kind that makes you second-guess whether you matter at all. But not today. Today, I walked through Cambridge like the city had finally let me in. The air was crisp, but not cold. The kind of cool that makes your lungs expand without effort. Trees arched overhead, the new leaves just beginning to unfold like stories trying to start again. The sunlight filtered through brick buildings, casting fractured patterns onto the sidewalks, where ivy dared to grow wild. I had nowhere urgent to be, and that was new. I passed by a bookstore cafe on Tremont, the smell of roasted espresso beans curling through the doorway. The bells above the entrance jingled as someone walked out holding a bag filled with the kind of thick, uncooperative hardcovers that demanded your attention. I smiled at the weight of it, at the thought of stories that didn't end in betrayal. In my leather tote bag, nestled between a notebook and my wallet, was the proposal draft for a manuscript I'd been writing in pieces late at night on park benches during lunch breaks. Its title, The Wedding and the Cost of Silence. I hadn't told many people about it. Just Nick, who read the first chapter and sent back one sentence. You don't write like someone trying to heal. You write like someone who already has. That meant more to me than he probably realized. The book wasn't a tell-all. It wasn't revenge. It was observation, truth. What silence does when you let it run your life. What happens when you trade authenticity for safety. What it costs to be invisible and what it takes to finally be seen. I reached the corner near Charles Street where the sidewalks widened and the boutiques leaned charmingly crooked like old friends. That's when I heard her voice, familiar, breezy, slightly too loud for public, but always perfectly timed. There you are. Miss, I wear navy blue to every family trauma. I turned. Samantha stood on the other side of the crosswalk, grinning in that way she always had. One brow cocked. Sunglasses pushed into her curls, denim jacket half off her shoulder like she'd been mid-strut for the last 10 years. I told you, she called as the light changed, walking toward me. I booked the table. You're not ghosting me for a 4th time in a row. I had legitimate excuses, I said, trying not to smile. You had avoidance, she corrected, linking her arm through mine like we were 17 again. But today is different. Today you're available. Emotionally, spiritually, brunchly. I don't think brunchly is a word. Shut up, future published author. That caught me off guard. I laughed, actual laughter, not the kind you offer politely when someone expects it. She grinned, wider, satisfied. I saw the cover design, she added. Minimalist, kind of haunting. Like you. I love it. It's not finalized. It's perfect. We walked toward the cafe. She'd reserved a sun-drenched bistro with outdoor seating and a chalkboard sign that read, Mimosas fix everything. I'm not sure the world's ready for my version of the story, I said as we waited for our table. You're not writing it for the world, she replied. You're writing it for the girl who used to sit in the corner of family photos and wonder if anyone noticed she was there. The words landed deep, and in that moment I felt something release inside me. A knot that had existed for decades finally loosened. Not gone, not erased, but untied. I looked around. People were talking, sipping lattes, laughing. A toddler somewhere nearby was dropping sugar packets like confetti. A woman walked past with a German shepherd so regal it might have run a kingdom in another life, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel like I was outside the frame watching through glass. I was here, living. Heads up, Samantha said, nudging me as the waiter appeared. We slid into our seats, menus already waiting. I already ordered, she added. Avocado toast for you, poached egg. Side of new chapter. You're ridiculous. I'm right. The sun hit the table just right. My phone buzzed an email from my editor. I didn't check it. Instead, I looked at my friend, at the street, at the world I'd almost given up on, and I raised my glass when she raised hers. To what I asked. Samantha tilted her head. To not being invisible anymore. We clinked. And just like that, a new story began. The bell above the cafe door gave its usual soft chime as I stepped inside. Outside, the Boston afternoon shimmered with that quiet golden glow that only comes at the very edge of summer's breath, cool enough for a scarf, warm enough to leave the coat at home. Inside, the cafe hummed with life. Steam hissed from the espresso machine's spoons clinked against ceramic mugs. A jazz playlist murmured under it all like a heartbeat keeping pace. I made my way to my usual corner, the window seat, the one with the crooked-legged table and the cracked leather chair that creaked when I leaned back. It wasn't fancy, and the view wasn't dramatic, just a small slice of Tremont Street with flower boxes and faded brick, the life of the city trotting by one dog leash, one grocery bag at a time. But it was mine. I set down my laptop notebook and a single black pen. Rituals mattered, not for performance but for grounding, for saying this is where I begin again. I ordered a flat white extra hot, and the barista Sam already had the cup ready before I reached the counter. He handed it over with a knowing nod. No small talk, just recognition. I liked that. Back at my table I opened the notebook. Blank page. Chapter 1 was behind me literally and metaphorically. My book draft had just passed its second editorial review. We were finalizing blurbs. Marketing was already teasing launch dates for early next year. But today wasn't about that. Today was for writing something new. Something just for me. I looked out the window as sunlight spilled through the glass. It hit the wood grain of the table in soft lines, catching the steam rising from my coffee, making it shimmer. The cafe smelled like cinnamon and ground beans. Someone in the corner laughed, the kind of deep, bellyful laughter that vibrates across rooms like a good song. And I breathed in, not to brace, not to resist, but to receive, because for the first time in a very, very long time, I didn't feel like I had to defend my space in the world. I didn't feel like I had to earn it. I didn't feel like I was compensating for the room I took up. I simply was, whole, present. And then the words came, not forced, not wrung from pain, but flowing like water over stone. I used to be a shadow. I paused. Not a metaphor, a memory. I could see it all, family photos where I was half-cropped, award ceremonies where my name was misspelled, the wedding where I sat by the ice sculpture next to a 5-year-old who spilled orange juice on my dress. All those moments where I swallowed myself to protect someone else's performance. But it turns out light only appears when darkness gets out of the way. My pen hovered. Outside, a little girl skipped past the window, hand in hand with her father, ice cream smeared on her cheek like war paint. She was laughing at something small and beautiful and just hers. I smiled. And for the first time in my life, I'm not waiting to be seen. A pause. I closed my eyes. Let the quiet settle around me like a blanket. Let the memory of everything, the vault, the vows, the betrayal, the courtroom, the letter soften into story. Not wait. And then I wrote the final line. I am the one stepping into the light. It wasn't grand. It wasn't loud. But it was real. And it was mine. I closed the notebook and sat back. Let the chair creak. Let the sun catch in my hair. And just for a moment I allowed myself the kind of stillness that once felt impossible. Not because there was nothing left to fight for, but because I no longer had to fight to exist. This moment, this light, this ordinary cup of coffee on an extraordinary day, this was healing, not the absence of pain, but the presence of peace. And as the jazz shifted into a quiet piano, and the world carried on just beyond the glass, I whispered the words out loud, quietly, only for me. I used to be the shadow, but now I am the one who casts it.